Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll try and summarise the question rather than read the whole thing out because it's quite a long question. I'm going back to July 2019 when we unanimously passed a motion that declared a climate and ecological emergency, and I've picked out in my statement, which precedes the question, 4 particular items that I think summarise what we were trying to do, which was for the council activities to get to net zero carbon by 2030, that we would support other agencies in trying to do the similar sort of thing with Chelmsford itself, and that we would cost out the plan and within 12 months actually show a plan of how we're going to do this, and we would establish a baseline for the ecological status and monitor the progress year on year. I do want to point out that this whole declaration transcends several administrations. So I am keen that whatever the next administration is and the one after that continue on this strategy, on this goal to get there by 2030. So with that in mind, really I'd like to know, as part of the questions, how are we doing? And particularly on, say, the council services or the council activities getting to zero by 2030, what was the starting point? I'm a fairly analytical sort of person, and I'd quite like to know what were our emissions, our carbon emissions, in July 2019. Presumably that's some sort of number of tons per annum, tons of carbon per annum. Have we scoped out what we mean by council activities? It's a bit vague. What does it include? What does it exclude? You know, if we plant some trees, does it include those as a carbon soak? Or if we plant those trees not on our land, is that still included? Our housing association activities included? Is the supply line to our services included? I don't want us to be fuzzy about the boundary of what's included and excluded, and find that we're actually including things that help and excluding things that don't help. And as part of that, in terms of the activities of Chelmsford City Council, how are we doing at the moment? Wherever we were in July 2019, how many tonnes of carbon are we producing now as at December 2020? So I'm looking for some real numbers here, given that we did actually declare it was an emergency, so I'm hoping we've made some real progress. Likewise, how are we doing on Chelmsford City, outside of the City Council activities? What was the starting point back in July 2019? How are we doing now? What carbon emissions is Chelmsford City producing at the moment? And then finally, the last part of the question is to say that given it was an emergency that we declared, how come we haven't looked at this in the Overview and Scrutiny Committee? I've asked several times that I'd like to see this. When could the Cabinet member please advise us when an initial report will come to the committee? Thank you. That's the question.
Thank you. Councillor Moore, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I would like to extend my thanks to Councillor Steele for his questions this evening. I'd like to just begin with the very last part of your questioning, Councillor Steele, if I may. When you asked in terms of the City of Chelmsford area emissions, they are produced by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, just as our own internal figures are worked through. And you also asked about the timeline for presenting these figures, and given that we declared a climate and ecological emergency in July 2019, why you haven't yet seen any figures. You should, I hope, be aware of the work plan for overview and scrutiny, which means that the meeting on the 1st of February 2021 will be the date when all of this information will come to you. This is because we declared our climate and ecological emergency on the 16th of July 2019 at full council. We subsequently, within that, agreed to produce the action plan, which is the all-important aspect of this, within 12 months. It was produced within 6 months, and it was actually approved by Cabinet on the 28th of January 2020. Now, that action plan is the starting point for the process to gather evidence towards overview and scrutiny. Overview and scrutiny on the 1st of February 2021 will be the annual marker for that. So I hope that reassures you that it has not been forgotten. It is indeed considered an emergency. It was before we came into administration, and we are acting now. If I may, I just go back to your first question. So you're asking, what was the starting point, our baseline, our carbon emissions activities from the Council in July 2019? The baseline figure we have goes to the financial year 2019-20, and I can confirm that carbon emissions from the Council's operations during that period were 5,370 tonnes CO2 emissions. You ask, what's the scope of Council's activities? What does this include? What does it exclude? Are trees planted by City Council counted towards carbon dioxide collection? And what if they are not on City Council land? Well, the baseline report we've drawn up is in line with best practice and the conversion figures published by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. That includes emissions which are generated from the Council's operations, and these are gas used to heat space and water in Council-owned and operated properties, liquid fuel used to power plant, machinery and vehicles or owned and operated by the Council, liquid fuels used to heat space and water in properties owned and operated by the Council, electricity used to provide power, heat and services in Council-owned properties, and business travel recorded by the Council's own staff. So the baseline calculation does not include the impact of any carbon offsetting measures, and this includes tree planting. Neither does it include carbon emissions from goods or services procured by the Council. However, I must state that tree planting is of course essential, not only to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, but also to address an essential part of our declaration, which is the threat to biodiversity, the ecological emergency that we face. And by the end of February 2021 planting season, we will have put 31,000 trees into our land, and we are also making sure that we're preserving and enhancing habitats. This is vital, and this goes hand in hand with the reduction of carbon emissions. Your next question, you ask whether housing association activities are included in our figures, and what about devolved stock of rented accommodation? Well, the housing association emissions will not be contained within the Council's report because we have no housing stock of our own. However, we work closely and are actually canvassing at the moment housing associations to check best practice for retrofitting, and we will be sure to work with them. They are one of the agencies that we intend to work with closely. It's very important that housing stock and social housing is as environmentally sound as possible, not only to reduce the carbon emissions, but also to provide excellent value and ensure that those properties are securely and properly heated and economically so. You've asked, does the supply line count if they serve any council services? Well, as I mentioned, the supply chains are covered within the definition of what we call Scope 3 emissions, which are discretionary. They're not currently included in standard calculation of the carbon baseline for the council's operations. Then you reference the importance that this must not be a fuzzy line so that favourable items can be included and non-favourable ones excluded, and I quite agree. The Council's carbon emissions baseline calculation does follow the methodologies and conversion factors published by the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and the Environment Agency for carbon reporting. Emissions fall into different types, as I've mentioned, Scope 1, 2 and 3. The scope of emissions indicates how far removed these are from the Council's control. Scope 1 is directly burnt or emitted by a council's assets. Scope 2 is indirectly emitted, so that could be fuels used to produce electricity that we use. Scope 3 can be any emission caused by the business but emitted by other parties or upstream supply chain emissions. Scopes 1 and 2 of emissions are tightly prescribed by guidance and are included in our calculation. However, there is more discretion in what is included in the calculation for Scope 3. For consistency, the only Scope 3 emissions we have included in the baseline report are those emissions from our employee business mileage, as they can be readily attributed to the operations of the council. I can assure you that the carbon baseline report will be separately audited before being considered for publication. Moving on, you've asked what the current carbon emissions of council activities are as of December 2020. I can give you the emissions for the first 6 months of the 2021 reporting year. That's April to September. This is 2,436 tonnes of CO2. However, caution's advised with this figure. There are large seasonal variations in data sources. For example, a number of sites won't have had heating oil deliveries during this data collection period. Now, yes, finally, I think you asked in terms of working with other agencies. So I think I've addressed that in terms of the wider area and the statistics for these will be delayed by 2 years. This is standard. The City of Chelmsford's area emissions are produced by the BEIS. They're aggregated from centralised data, and then they will be published at local authority levels. So the data for emissions in 2019 will not actually be published until 2021. The statistics are published annually in June, and as I said, I think the 2018 estimates, which were published in June 2020, indicate the City Council's area-wide emissions to be 4.8 tonnes of carbon per capita. Madam Mayor, I know, well, you will know, it's every single action that we take, or decisions we make, leaves a footprint, whether that's a carbon footprint that can be measured, or whether it's a mark or scar on the landscape itself. I know that you understand too that we must all learn to tread gently. The population of Chelmsford is growing fast and looks set to be over 200,000 by 2036. In admitting that we have a problem locally and nationally and internationally, it's just essential now to monitor our carbon reduction progress, but also lead by example. We all, as councillors, as officers, as residents, can take steps to change our behaviour and to reduce the impact we are making on our local environment, but also the wider world and the very planet that sustains us. The planet will look after itself. It's seen many ice ages come and go, but we must learn to live in a more symbiotic way. We must not have a parasitic relationship with the planet. I can assure you, Councillor Steele, that I remain committed to this, as I campaigned for election, and I'm very proud that the City Council officers and staff are working so hard to do everything we can to address this crisis. I hope you're reassured that the figures are here, and I look forward to present the figures to you over the scrutiny come February, so that you are able to continue monitoring. And I would like to thank you once again for your interest this evening. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, may I respond very briefly?
Very briefly, please.
Yeah, I would just like to thank Councillor Moore for giving the answers, which included quite a few numbers. So I would ask that she could send me some sort of written report so I can absorb some of those numbers. That would be very useful. And I look forward to the February 2021 response of the progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
I now call on Councillor Dodson, who has a question, I understand.